The leather strap cracked against Mavis Holloway's shoulders with a sickening snap that echoed through the cramped boarding house kitchen. She didn't cry out, hadn't made a sound during beatings for months, now, but her knees buckled as another wave of fever swept through her frail body. Worthless wretch. Cornelius Grimm's voice boomed above her as she collapsed onto the grease-stained floor. The boarding house owner's massive frame cast a shadow over her trembling form. 3 days you've been too sick to scrub floors, and my paying guests are complaining about the filth. Mavis pressed her cheek against the cold wooden planks, tasting blood where she'd bitten her tongue. The consumption had been eating away at her lungs for weeks, each coughing fit leaving crimson specks on her threadbare apron. But Grimm didn't believe in sickness only, in laziness and excuses. "Please, Mr. Grimm," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire in the kitchen stove. "I can work. Just give me a moment too." The boot caught her in the ribs, sending her skidding across the floor until her back hit the wall. Stars danced behind her eyelids as Grimm's heavy footsteps approached again. "You'll work, all right, sick or not. You owe me 3 months' room and board, and I'll get my money's worth out of your hide before you die on me." Through the kitchen window, Mavis caught a glimpse of the main street of Millbrook Creek. The small Colorado town was bustling with its usual afternoon activity, miners heading home from the silver mines, shopkeepers sweeping their storefronts, children playing in the dusty road. It's a normal world that seemed impossibly far from the hell she lived in. She'd been indentured to Grimm since her father's death 2 winters ago, working off his gambling debts in this rat-infested boarding house. What started as a 6-month arrangement had stretched into endless servitude as Grimm kept adding charges: broken dishes, spoiled food, doctor visits when her coughing got too violent to ignore. "Get up." Oh. Grimm yanked her to her feet by her tangled auburn hair. "Mrs. Patterson in room 4 wants fresh linens. And if you don't have them changed before supper, you'll get another taste of my belt." Mavis nodded weakly, swaying on her feet. The room spun around her like a child's top, and she gripped the edge of the wooden table to steady herself. Her hands shook as she reached for the basket of clean sheets, the simple motion sending sharp pains through her battered ribs as she stumbled toward the stairs. Another coughing fit seized her. This time, the blood came in a steady stream, spattering the clean linens she carried. Grimm's curses followed her up the narrow staircase, promising worse punishment for ruining his property. In the dim hallway, surrounded by the sounds of drunken laughter from the saloon below and the creak of old wood settling, Mavis Holloway made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't take another beating. She couldn't survive another winter in this place. Tonight, when the town slept, and Grimm drank himself into his usual stupor, she would run. Even if it killed her, even if she died alone in the wilderness, it would be better than this slow torture. She didn't know that downstairs, a tall stranger with kind eyes and worn leather chaps had just walked through the front door, asking Cornelius Grimm if he had any work for a cowboy down on his luck. Cale Thornfield removed his weathered hat as he stepped into the dim interior of Grimm's boarding house, his steel-gray eyes adjusting to the poor light. The smell hit him: first stale whiskey, unwashed bodies, and something else that made his jaw clench. Fear. He'd smelled it on too. Many ranches where workers were treated worse than cattle. You looking for a room, or just standing there gawking? Cornelius Grimm's voice boomed from behind the bar, where he was polishing glasses with a dirty rag. "Neither. Heard you might have work for a man who knows horses and cattle." Cale's voice was quiet but steady, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard without raising his voice. Grimm looked him up and down, taking in the quality. Leather of his boots, the well-maintained colt on his hip, and the way he carried himself. Might be. Depends on what you're asking for wages. Before Cale could answer, the sound of violent coughing echoed from upstairs, followed by a crash that made the floorboards shake. Then came Grimm's bellowing voice. Damn your clumsy hide. Heavy footsteps thundered up the stairs. Cale set his hat on the bar and followed without invitation, his spurs jingling softly on the worn wooden steps. What he saw in the upstairs hallway made his hands curl into fists. A young woman barely more than a girl crumpled beside an overturned basket of linens, now stained with bright red blood. Her dress was torn and dirty, revealing bruises in various stages of healing across her pale arms. But it was her eyes that stopped him, cold green as spring grass, but holding a depth of pain that spoke of suffering far beyond her years. What in hell do you think you're doing up here? Grim demanded, his face red with rage and whiskey. Helping a sick woman, Cale replied, kneeling beside Mavis despite Grim's protests. Up close, he could see the fever burning in her cheeks, the way her slight frame shook with each labored breath. She needs a doctor. She needs to learn her place. Grim raised his hand to strike her again, but found his wrist caught in Cale's iron grip. I wouldn't. The cowboy's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. In fact, I think you and I need to discuss terms of employment. For a moment, the two men stared at each other, Grim's bulky frame dwarfing the leaner cowboy, but Cale's quiet strength making the bigger man step back. What kind of terms? Grim asked suspiciously. The kind where this young lady comes with me as part of my wages. Cale helped Mavis to her feet, supporting her weight as she swayed. I'm in need of a housekeeper for my cabin up in the foothills. Someone to cook and tend to things while I work my claim. Mavis looked up at him in shock, her green eyes wide with disbelief. No one had ever spoken up for her before, certainly not a stranger. She owes me money, Grim growled. 3 months' room and board, plus damages. Cale reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. Soft clink of gold coins made Grim's eyes light up with greed. How much? $50. Without hesitation, Cale counted out the coins and dropped them into Grim's outstretched palm. Done. The lady's debt is paid. Now wait, just as Grim started to protest, but Cale had already turned his attention back to Mavis. Can you walk, miss? He asked gently. She nodded, though her legs shook with the effort. I don't understand. Why would you... Because everyone deserves better than this, Cale said simply. He gathered her few belongings, a worn carpet bag containing 2 threadbare dresses and her mother's Bible, and helped her down the stairs. As they reached the front door, Mavis turned back to look at the place that had been her prison. Grim stood at the top of the stairs, counting his gold and muttering about losing good help. What's your name? Cale asked, as he helped her onto his horse. Mavis Holloway, she whispered, her voice hoarse from coughing. Well, Miss Holloway, I'm Cale Thornfield. And I promise you this, no one will ever raise a hand to you again while you're under my protection. As they rode out of Millbrook Creek toward the pine-covered hills, Mavis felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 years: hope. The cabin appeared through the golden aspens like something from a dream. Built of solid pine logs with a stone chimney already sending smoke curling into the crisp mountain air. It sat in a meadow, surrounded by towering evergreens and carpeted with light summer wildflowers. A clear stream bubbled nearby, and Mavis could see a small garden plot and a sturdy barn in the distance. It's beautiful, she breathed, then immediately caught herself. She had no right to admire his home. She was here to work, nothing more. Cale helped her down from his horse with gentle hands, noticing how she favored her left side where Grim's boot had connected. It's not much, but it's peaceful. No one bothers you up here except the occasional elk and the ravens. Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a simple wooden table and 2 chairs nearby. A ladder led to a loft area, and Mavis could see a narrow bed tucked into the corner. The main floor held a larger bed covered with a colorful quilt, a washstand, and shelves lined with books, more books than she'd seen since her father's death. "You can have the main bed," Cale said, reading her thoughts. "I'll take the loft. Are you hungry?" Before she could answer, another coughing fit seized her. This one was worse than the others, leaving her doubled over and gasping for breath. When it passed, she looked down to see fresh blood staining her palm. Cale was beside her in an instant, helping her to the bed. "How long have you been sick? Eh?" "Few weeks," she lied, not wanting to burden him with the truth. His gray eyes studied her face with an intensity that made her look away. "Mavis, I need you to be honest with me. How long?" The kindness in his voice broke through the walls she'd built around her heart since early summer. It started as just a cough, but then she gestured helplessly at the blood on her hand. Cale nodded grimly. "Consumption? I've seen it before." He moved to a trunk in the corner and pulled out a thick woolen blanket. "The mountain air will help, but you need rest and good food. No more working yourself to death." "But you paid for me to keep house. I paid to get you away from that animal." Cale's voice was firm, but gentle. "You'll earn your keep when you're well enough. For now, your job is to get better." Over the following days, Cale proved to be unlike any man Mavis had ever known. He cooked simple but nourishing meals, brought her wildflower tea that soothed her throat, and never once raised his voice or showed impatience with her slow recovery. In the evenings, he would sit by the fire carving small wooden figures while she read from his collection of books by lamplight. "Where did you learn to read so well?" he asked one evening, as she finished a passage from Tennyson aloud. "My father was a schoolteacher before the gambling took hold," she said softly. "He taught me that books were doorways to places where pain couldn't follow." Cale looked up from the small wooden horse he was carving. "Smart man. What happened to him? Consumption, like me. But his was of the spirit, not the lungs. After my mother died, he couldn't find his way back to the light." Mavis closed the book and traced its worn cover with her finger. "I think he chose to die rather than keep fighting. And you? Are you choosing to fight?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from the dying fire. Mavis studied his face in the flickering light, the strong jaw softened by compassion, the eyes that looked at her like she mattered. "I didn't think I had anything to fight for," she admitted. "But now, now I think maybe I do." The words came out as barely a whisper, but she saw his hands still on the carving, saw the way his breathing changed. "Mavis," he said carefully, "I want you to know that whatever happens between us, you're safe here. You don't owe me anything beyond your own healing." But as she watched him return to his carving, Mavis realized that for the first time in her life, she wanted to owe someone something. She wanted to matter to this quiet, strong man who had saved her without expecting anything in return. Outside, the first snow of autumn began to fall, dusting the cabin roof with white. Winter was coming, and with it, the test of weather too. Broken souls could find wholeness in each other. The first snow had melted and returned. Twice more before Mavis felt truly strong again. October painted the mountainside in brilliant reds and golds, and she found herself spending hours each day outside, breathing the crisp air that no longer sent her into fits of coughing. The consumption hadn't disappeared. She knew it never, when entirely but Cale's patient care and the mountain's healing embrace had given her something she'd never thought to have again, a future. She stood at the cabin's single window, watching him work with his horses in the meadow. He'd built up a small herd over the past month, trading his wood-carving skills and occasional trips to town for breeding stock. His movements were fluid and sure as he gentled a young stallion, his voice too low to hear, but clearly calming the nervous animal. "You're staring again," she murmured to herself, but couldn't bring herself to look away. Somewhere in the weeks of shared meals, quiet conversations by the fire, and gentle arguments over who should do which chores. Her gratitude had transformed into something deeper and more dangerous. The cabin door opened with a soft creak, and Cale's presence filled the space behind her. She'd grown so attuned to him that she could tell his moods by the sound of his footsteps, the way he set down his hat. "The stallion's coming along well," she said without turning around. "Mavis." His voice was different, strained like a rope, pulled too tight. "We need to talk." Her heart clenched and she gripped the windowsill. This was it. He'd nursed her back to health out of duty, and now he wanted her gone. Where would she go? Back to town. Find another position where her illness would make her a burden. "I'll pack my things," she said quietly. "What?" The surprise in his voice made her turn around. Cale stood in the doorway, his hat forgotten in his hands, staring at her with something that looked like pain. "Why would you pack your things? Because you want me to leave? I can hear it in your voice." "Jesus, Mavis." He crossed the room. In 3 quick strides, his hands hovering near her shoulders as if he wanted to touch her but didn't dare. "I don't want you to leave. That's the problem." Now it was her turn to stare. "I don't understand." Cale ran a hand through his dark hair, leaving it disheveled. "I brought you here to help you heal, not to complicate your life with my feelings, your feelings." "Christ, woman, are you blind?" The words burst out of him with the force of too much pressure behind a dam. "I can barely sleep in that damned loft, knowing you're 10 feet below me. I catch myself listening for your breathing at night to make sure you're all right. I've memorized the way you hum while you cook, the way you tuck your hair behind your ear when you're reading." He stopped, his jaw working as he fought for control. Maeve is felt her world tilt on its axis. "Cale, ... I know it's wrong. You're vulnerable, recovering. You probably feel grateful, maybe even think you owe me something. But that's not." She silenced him by placing her fingers against his lips. The contact sent electricity racing up her arm, and she saw his eyes darken in response. "Do you think I'm stupid?" she asked softly. "What? Do you think I'm so simple that I can't tell the difference between gratitude and love?" The word hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they dared cross. Cale's hands finally settled on her shoulders, his touch reverent and careful. "Love," he whispered. "I've been beaten, starved, and left to die. But I'm not broken," Mavis said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I know what cruelty looks like, and I know what kindness looks like. But what I see in your eyes when you look at me, ... that's something else entirely. Mavis, I love you too, Cale Thornfield. I love your gentle hands and your quiet strength. I love the way you carve little horses by the fire and pretend not to notice when I watch you. I love that you saved me, not because you wanted something from me, but because it was the right thing to do." His hands cupped her face, thumbs brushing over her cheekbones with infinite tenderness. "Are you sure? Once we cross this line, there's no going back." Instead of answering with words, she rose up on her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, but when he responded with a low sound of surrender, it deepened into something that spoke of all the lonely nights and unspoken longings they'd both endured. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Cale rested his forehead against hers. "I need to ask you properly," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Ask me what?" "Mavis Holloway, will you marry me? Will you be my wife, not my housekeeper? And let me spend the rest of my life proving that you're worth more than all the gold in these mountains?" Through tears of joy, she whispered, "Yes." The wedding took place on a brilliant November morning when the first real snow had turned the world into a crystalline wonderland. Pastor Mackenzie from Millbrook Creek made the treacherous journey up the mountain trail. along with Doc Harrison, who insisted on checking Mavis one more time before pronouncing her remarkably improved, considering. Mavis wore a dress that Cale had somehow procured from Denver deep blue silk that brought out her eyes and fit her newly healthy figure perfectly. She'd put on weight over the past months, her cheeks now holding the roses of health rather than fever. Her auburn hair fell in soft waves to her waist, crowned with a simple circlet of late-blooming asters that Cale had woven himself. "You look beautiful," he said, as they stood before the pastor in their small cabin, his voice thick with emotion. "You clean up pretty well yourself, cowboy," she replied, admiring the way his dark suit emphasized his broad shoulders and made his gray eyes shine like silver. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. When Pastor Mackenzie pronounced them man and wife, Cale's kiss was tender and full of promise. Tasting of new beginnings and forever after, their first year of marriage flew by in a blur of shared work and growing love. Cale's horse breeding operation flourished as word spread about the quality of his stock. Mavis proved to have an unexpected talent for the business side of things, keeping meticulous records and charming potential buyers with her quick wit and genuine warmth. By spring, they'd added a room to the cabin, complete with a real glass window that caught the morning light and threw rainbows across the wooden floor. Cale installed shelves for her growing collection of books, and Mavis planted a proper vegetable garden that soon became the envy of neighbors from miles around. Rivka Thorne thinks she grows the finest tomatoes in Colorado, Doc Harrison remarked during one of his monthly visits, biting into one of Mavis's specimens with obvious pleasure. But these put hers to shame. "Don't let her hear you say that," Mavis laughed. "She already thinks I'm some kind of witch for how fast my consumption improved." Speaking of which, Doc Harrison set down his medical bag and fixed her with a serious look. "How are you feeling, truly? Any shortness of breath? Night sweats?" Mavis and Cale exchanged a meaningful glance. "Actually, Doc, that's something we wanted to discuss with you." The older man's eyebrows rose. "Oh, I've been feeling a different kind of sick lately," Mavis said, her cheeks pink with something that had nothing to do with fever. "Queasy in the mornings, tired by afternoon, and—" She placed a hand over her still flat stomach. Doc Harrison's weathered face broke into a grin. "Well, I'll be damned. How long since your last monthly?" "6 weeks," Cale answered, his voice filled with wonder and barely contained excitement. "Is it safe?" "With her condition. The mountain air and your good care have worked miracles," Doc Harrison said, pulling out his stethoscope. "Let's have a listen, shall we?" After a thorough examination, the doctor confirmed what they'd hoped and feared in equal measure. Mavis was pregnant, and despite her history with consumption, both she and the baby appeared healthy. "You'll need to be careful," he warned. "It's plenty of rest, good food, and no lifting anything heavier than a coffee cup. But I see no reason why you can't carry this child to term." That night, as they lay in bed with Mavis curled against Cale's side, she traced patterns on his chest and marveled at how completely their lives had changed. "Are you scared?" she asked softly. Terrified, he admitted. "What if I don't know how to be a father? What if something goes wrong? Then we'll figure it out together, just like everything else." She pressed a kiss to his chest, right over his steadily beating heart. "Besides, any child of yours will be lucky to have such a good, gentle man to look up to." "Any child of ours," he corrected, his hand finding hers and threading their fingers together. "We're in this together, remember?" Outside their window, an owl called through the darkness and the stream sang its eternal song. In 7 months, they would welcome a daughter with Mavis's green eyes and Cale's quiet strength. She would grow up knowing nothing but love and security, surrounded by books and horses and the endless beauty of the Colorado mountains. But that was still in the future. For now, it was enough to hold each other close and dream of the family they were building. One day at a time, Little Iona Thornfield entered the world on a snow-swept March morning, arriving 3 weeks early, and announcing her presence with lusty cries that echoed off the cabin walls. Doc Harrison, who had moved his practice temporarily to a cabin down the mountain to be closer during Mavis's final month, declared her the healthiest premature baby I've ever delivered. "She's perfect," Cale whispered, his large hands cradling the tiny bundle with infinite care. Tears streaked down his weathered cheeks as he counted her fingers and toes, marveling at the impossibly small fingernails and the downy red-gold hair that crowned her head. Mavis, exhausted but radiant, watched her husband fall in love with their daughter. The birth had been difficult, her weakened lungs had struggled with the exertion, but the moment Iona was placed in her arms, every moment of pain was forgotten. "She has your eyes," Mavis observed, noting the way the baby's gaze seemed to focus with unusual intensity for one so young. "And your stubborn streak, I'd wager," Cale replied, laughing as Iona's tiny fist closed around his finger with surprising strength. "Look at that grip. She'll be riding horses before she can walk." The first months of parenthood tested them in ways they'd never imagined. Iona was a colicky baby, crying for hours despite their best efforts. Mavis, still recovering from childbirth and dealing with flare-ups of her consumption brought on by lack of sleep, often found herself in tears alongside their daughter. "I'm failing her," she sobbed one particularly difficult night as Iona's cries pierced the darkness. "A good mother would know what she needs." Cale took the baby from her trembling arms and began the slow walk around the cabin that sometimes soothed their daughter's distress. "You're not failing anyone," he said firmly. "You're learning just like I am, just like every parent who ever lived." By summer, they'd found their rhythm. Kona began sleeping through the night, her colic finally easing, and Mavis's strength returned enough for her to help with the horses again. The business was thriving word of Cale's gentle training methods and quality. Stock had spread throughout Colorado Territory. One August afternoon, as Mavis sat in the shade of their porch nursing Iona while Cale worked with a spirited mare, in the corral, an unexpected visitor rode up the mountain path. Mavis's blood ran cold as she recognized the bulky figure of Cornelius Grimm. "Well, well," Grimm wheezed as he dismounted his laboring horse. "Heard you'd done all right for yourself up here, girl. Thought I'd pay a social call," Cale had spotted. The man-and was already striding toward the cabin, his face set in hard lines. "Grimm, you're not welcome here. Now is that any way to treat an old friend?" Grimm's eyes fixed on the baby at Mavis's breast with an expression that made her skin crawl. "Pretty little thing. Be worth a lot to the right people. Get off my land." Cale's voice was deadly quiet, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt dot. Grimm held up his hands in mock surrender. "Oh, no need for hostility. I'm just thinking that maybe our arrangement wasn't quite as finished as you thought. See, I've been doing some checking, and it turns out that debt you paid. Well, there's interest, compounding interest. And now that the girl's got herself a baby," he never finished the sentence. Cale's fist connected with his jaw with a sound like splitting wood, sending the bigger man sprawling in the dust. "The only arrangement between us," Cale said, standing over Grimm's groaning form, "is that you leave this mountain right now and never come back. If I see you anywhere near my wife or daughter again, they'll never find all the pieces." Grimm struggled to his feet, spitting blood. "This ain't over, Thornfield. Ha! That woman owes me, and I always collect." "The woman owes you nothing," Mavis said, rising from her chair with Iona still in her arms. Her voice was steady, showing none of the fear that twisted her stomach. "I paid that debt with 2 years of slavery and blood. But if you want to try taking what's mine, you're welcome to see how much I've learned about fighting back." For the first time since she'd known him, Mavis saw uncertainty flicker in Grimm's eyes. The broken, beaten girl he'd tormented was gone. replaced by a woman who'd found her strength and wouldn't surrender it. He mounted his horse without another word and rode away. But not before shooting them a look of pure malice that promised this encounter wasn't their last. "He'll be back," Cale said grimly, watching until Grim disappeared around a bend in the trail. "Let him come," Mavis replied, surprising herself with her vehemence. "I'm not that scared girl anymore, and this is our home, our family. I'll fight for it." That night, as they lay in bed with Iona sleeping peacefully in her cradle nearby, Cale pulled Mavis close and pressed his face into her hair. "I love you," he whispered. "I love who you've become, who you've always been, underneath all that fear." "I love you too," she replied. "Tomorrow, we start teaching our daughter that she never has to be afraid of bullies like Cornelius Grimm." 3 years later, Iona Thornfield was indeed riding horses before most children could properly walk, just as her father had predicted. The bright-eyed toddler had inherited her mother's quick wit and her father's gentle way with animals, spending her days following Cale around the ranch on her small pony or helping Mavis in the expanded garden that now supplied vegetables to half of Millbrook Creek. The Thornfield Ranch had become one of the most respected horse breeding operations in Colorado Territory. Their home had grown to a proper 2-story house, now stood where the simple cabin once did, with glass windows in every room and a wide porch that looked out over the mountain meadows. Mavis stood at the kitchen window, her hands resting on her rounded belly where their second child grew strong and healthy. At 6 months pregnant, she glowed with vitality. Her consumption now nothing more than an occasional cough that Doc Harrison assured them was manageable with continued care. "Mama, look." Iona burst through the front door, her red gold curls flying behind her as she ran toward the window.
"Appa's teaching Thunder to bow."
Outside, Cale was indeed working with their prize stallion, his patient movements drawing the magnificent animal into a perfect bow. At 32, he'd grown even more handsome, his face weathered by sun and wind into strong lines that spoke of a man comfortable with his place in the world. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Mavis said, lifting Iona into her arms despite her advanced pregnancy. "But what have I told you about running in the house?" "That lady's walk with grace and dignity," Iona recited dutifully, then grinned. "But I'm not a lady yet. I'm still a little girl." Mavis laughed and pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead. "You're my little girl, that's for certain. Now, why don't you help me set the table? Papa will be hungry when he comes in." As they worked together, Iona chattering about her adventures with the horses and Mavis humming an old song her own mother had taught her. Neither noticed the lone rider approaching from the southern trail. Cornelius Grimm had changed in the 3 years since his last visit. Prison for a charge of assault that Cale had made sure stuck after. Grimm's last visit had hardened him into something even more dangerous. His eyes held the flat shine of a man who'd lost whatever humanity he'd once possessed. He dismounted behind the barn, out of sight of the house, and checked the knife at his belt. He'd spent 3 long years planning this moment, dreaming of the revenge he'd take on the family that had cost him his freedom. The first sign of trouble came when Thunder trumpeted a warning from the corral. Cale looked up from his training session, his instincts sharpened by years of living in the mountains. Something was wrong. He saw Grimm at the same moment the ex-convict spotted him. The knife flashed silver in the afternoon sun as Grimm charged across the yard, his face twisted with rage and madness. "Cale!" Mavis's scream rang out from the house as she saw the danger. Cale sidestepped the knife thrust and grabbed Grimm's wrist, the 2 men crashing to the ground in a tangle of limbs. At 55, Grimm was slower than he'd once been. But prison had taught him dirty tricks that Cale's honorable nature couldn't match. The blade sliced across Cale's shoulder, drawing blood and a grunt of pain. Grimm pressed his advantage, driving Cale back toward the house where Mavis stood in the doorway, holding Iona behind her despite her pregnancy. "This ends here." Grim snarled, raising the knife for a killing blow. The shot rang out across the meadow like thunder. Grim staggered, looking down in shock at the spreading red stain across his chest, then fell to his knees. Mavis lowered the smoking rifle with shaking hands. "I warned you what would happen if you came back," she said quietly. Grim pitched forward into the dirt and lay still. The threat that had haunted their dreams for 3 years was finally over. "Mama, why is the bad man sleeping in our yard?" Iona asked with the innocent curiosity of a child too young to understand death. "He's not sleeping, little one," Cale said gently, pulling his wife and daughter into his arms despite the blood seeping from his wounded shoulder. "He's gone away forever, and he can never hurt us again." Doc Harrison arrived within the hour, summoned by the sound of gunshot that echoed off the mountain walls. After patching up Cale's shoulder and examining the body, he shook his head grimly. "Self-defense, clear as day," he pronounced. Man was a known criminal, and he came here armed. Sheriff won't have any questions about this. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the Thornfield family stood on their porch and watched Doc Harrison and 2 men from town load Grim's body into a wagon. The nightmare was truly over. "What happens now?" Mavis asked, her hand resting protectively over their unborn child.